Abortion is no longer a constitutional right in the United States after the Supreme Court overturned the 1973 Roe versus Wade ruling. In its ruling on Friday, the Supreme Court said the 1973 decision was egregiously wrong from the start, and its reasoning was exceptionally weak with damaging consequences. The ruling by the Supreme Court has brought to an end half a century of constitutional protection of abortion rights and now allows each state to decide on whether to allow or stop abortions. Let's get you more on this. We're joined by Laura Gonzalez-Lopez, who is a health journalist. Laura, thank you for availing yourself this afternoon. A surprise or to be expected?
Well, it's certainly a decision that people, I think, in the United States expected. We did have the news service Politico leaked a draft of this judgment several months ago that indicated that the court was moving to overturn Roe versus Wade, which, of course, protects the right to abortion as part of the constitutionally guaranteed right to privacy in the United States. It's also important to note that Roe versus Wade sets the precedent for protecting same-sex marriage in the United States as well. So certainly something that's been sort of expected. The Republican Party has spent the last 5 years or so packing the Supreme Court seats with conservative judges. Republican legislatures in states have set up these laws that really are kind of set to fall now that this decision has come to pass, restricting, as you mentioned, abortion access in almost half of the U.S. states, these states headed by Republican governors and legislatures.
Let's expand on that, because individual states now have the power to decide.
Right. So what you're going to see is states like New York and California have already started pumping money into their care systems to set themselves up as what's being called sanctuary states. So if women or people who are pregnant can get to these states, they can get abortions. But obviously we know, historically speaking, that really puts abortions out of reach for poor women, women of color, for instance. The other things to note about the way that these state laws have been written is that they would also criminalize miscarriages. So there's going to be, many people fear, an increase in maternal mortality, not only because women who miscarry cannot kind of complete that process and deliver the remnants of the pregnancy safely, but also because historically, research has shown that when you limit access to safe abortion, people find a way. So they're more likely to turn to do-it-yourself methods, dangerous illegal providers. So people are really expecting this to have a very sort of concrete impact on the lives of women in the U.S. But there's also fears that this now sets off sort of a chain reaction and will embolden the Christian right in the United States, which pumps money into Africa, sort of dark money to fund organizations, to limit the right to abortion here. Because Roe versus Wade also protects same-sex marriage, I think that you could see the same thing happening in terms of these Christian groups opposing LGBTIQ rights. I think what it certainly indicates is that the U.S. foreign policy on reproductive health will become even more stricter under future Republican presidents, and that's really a bad news sort of scenario for Africa. We're heavily reliant on U.S. aid. And when that happens, I think it really does hurt women's access to reproductive health and contraception and healthcare here.
And that's just it, right? So you speak of this dark money being channeled onto the continent and other work that is being done rather onto the continent with the issue of, reproductive rights is concerned. Already we started seeing reaction with people in Mississippi out and about, where people are saying, well, so you can give people guns, and we just saw the recent shooting spree at a school. But here you are wanting to dictate on women's bodies. Is this it, though?
I think that you might find appeals. I think that this is people. I think have been kind of planning as. I'm not sure that this can be appealed. Let me put it this way. But right now, what you see in the U.S. is a lot of people mobilizing to form like local networks, to fund local providers of safe abortions, and to start figuring out ways to get people across state lines if they need to. In some states, that it also is criminalized. So the state of Texas, for instance, has an infamous law that allows citizens to report on other citizens if they aid and abet a woman looking for a safe abortion outside of state lines. So I think it's a very worrying decision with definite repercussions for the rest of the world. This also comes at a time where more countries than ever before in Africa are looking at opening up access to safe abortions. So a lot of researchers I've spoken to on the continent are very afraid that this is going to set that movement back, because we have a lot of countries, even in West Africa, that are right sort of on the precipice of making some real changes in their legislation. And again, that those Christian groups have a lot of power and a lot of funding.
But this wasn't a unanimous decision, right? So even in the voting, who is Justice Samuel Alito?
Right. So what's happened is under former President Donald Trump, the court saw several seats filled by Republican conservative nominees. You're a Supreme Court justice until you either die or you retire. So those are seats that are held for a very long time. The Republican Party has been looking to overturn Roe versus Wade literally since the day after it passed in 1973. So this is really the conclusion of a very long-running campaign by that party to do this. You mentioned guns. The Supreme Court just this week in the U.S. also overturned legislation in New York that would have limited people's ability to buy guns. This, of course, in the wake of one of the most horrific school shootings that the U.S. has seen in decades.
A far-reaching decision for decades to come. But let's just go to Mississippi and take in some of these sights and sounds coming from the ground. Laura, as we are talking to you, we're seeing some people embracing. We're not quite sure whether, it's just tears of joy or rather frustration, but we are hearing something coming out there saying this decision must not be accepted. This decision must be reversed. I beg your pardon. You did mention that, chances of an appeal would not be successful. But as we talk about the consequences for decades to come, just paint a picture of what we're talking about. You also touched on the continent and the consequences for the continent.
Right. So, it's difficult, right, because, it is the highest court in the land. I'm not a legal expert. So I think I will say that court is heavily stacked in terms of conservative judges that we know are going to oppose access to reproductive health measures, that have opposed stricter gun control. So, trying to put that decision again before that court might not provide an alternate sort of outcome. But we do know, it's very well documented from research around the world, that when you limit access to safe abortions for people, maternal mortality, deaths among pregnant people, deaths among people who have just given birth rise dramatically. You can see it when, I think people find a way to take the decisions that they want to take about their bodies, because ultimately it's their body. I think the other thing to mention is, again, that this decision in many of those states, those laws are written so broadly that it would criminalize you for even having a natural miscarriage. And that's something that's actually divided the sort of anti-abortion, anti-choice lobby, because they can't really figure out internally whether they're on board to criminalize people who naturally just lose a pregnancy. What really is, as people have been saying, is that for, Africa, obviously, countries here we all have our own sovereignty. South Africa has one of the most liberal abortion policies on the continent. But what happens is when Republicans, who kind of have been pushing this agenda, get into power, they invoke something called the gag rule, which means that the U.S. defunds any organization that provides or even speaks to people about safe abortion as an option. And what happens here is, even though technically we should be protected from that because abortion is a guaranteed right here in South Africa, we end up losing healthcare services during those periods because that policy defunds some of the nonprofits that provide contraception, HIV testing. And so we ourselves, even though we should be protected from that, U.S. foreign policy get the brunt of it. And so Roe versus Wade doesn't immediately change anything for any African country, but what it does is it, again, emboldens those groups that help fund the anti-abortion, anti-choice pushes here, embolden those groups that kind of work to repress LGBTIQ rights on the continent. And then also, it's very hard to imagine a scenario where the next time a Republican president enters the U.S. presidency, that gag rule isn't even more restrictive than we've seen before, which means it can gag HIV funding, which was horrifically impactful in terms of the losses that we saw in terms of healthcare services, HIV testing, huge amounts of maternal mortality that have been attributed to Donald Trump's gag rule most recently.
Laura Gonzalez-Lopez is a health journalist. Thank you very much for availing yourself. And